Okay, I did it. I went out and bought this year's most overhyped camera, the Nikon ZR. So I've only had the camera for about a week and a half, maybe almost 2 weeks when this goes out. So this is going to be a very limited first impressions video about what I like so far with this camera and also what I really don't like about it. I think the last time I, genuinely got excited and giddy about a camera was probably the Red Komodo, just because it was doing something so different and offering you something so new at a crazy price point. So when Nikon announced the ZR, I was really intrigued. I kind of got that little tingle of excitement again because, a bit like the Komodo, it seemed to be a bit of a punk, a bit of a freak. A tiny full frame camera with 6K up to 60 frames a second in a red raw color science and codec with an optical low pass filter. I was really interested. The fact that it has up to 120 frames a second in a Super 35 crop in red raw. In 4K, again, seemed incredible. Autofocus, IBIS, 32-bit flow audio, and then cherry on top, a huge 4-inch articulating screen. So I'll be honest, I'm only really interested in this for the red raw. For a while, I've really wanted like a small compact cinema camera, like something with an optical low pass filter, something with like a nice organic image that I could use for my YouTube work, for my lens sample footage videos. Something that doesn't need to be rigged up with an external monitor, but can still shoot like raw and produce like a nice organic image. So this seems like a really strong contender for that. I'd say so far, my impressions of this camera are good. They are mixed. The 6K red raw that comes out of this camera does look stunning. Like, it's not quite on the level of my Komodo, but it's damn close. And especially, for the price of this thing, it's close enough. Maybe it is just a little bit sharper, a little less organic, a little less thick. I don't know, I need to test it more. I have mostly been shooting so far on a sort of modern stills lens, not a lens that I typically would shoot on my Komodo. And obviously the Komodo is Super 35 and this is full frame, which might also sort of, add some perceivable difference in how I interpret the footage. But the footage does undeniably look like it's come from a red camera. We've got the red color science in there and it really does make the image sing. Skin tones especially have weight and depth to them. They're juicy and thick. It has that slightly sort of warmy, greeny, grungy look that I like from my Komodo. It has the lovely sort of highlight fall off as well. Image doesn't look too harsh or too sharp even when I'm shooting on a modern lens. In terms of dynamic range, at the moment I'm mostly stuck to shooting in red raw, and it does clip quite low down. And I would say the kind of like window of what you have between clipping your highlights and getting noise in your shadows is maybe a little bit smaller than what I would expect from other cameras, especially my Red Komodo and especially my S1 Mark II. But that's only half of the story, right? Like, what is this camera like to use? It's definitely a confusing camera. Like, what does it want to be? Is it a cinema camera? Is it this like crazy video-centric, raw, capable camera in a tiny form factor? Does it want us to take photos on it? It's got, the photo video switch here. It's got horrendous menus in it that you would expect to find in your average mirrorless hybrid camera. But it has a beautiful, gorgeous, massive screen. The image quality is fantastic. It has an optical low pass filter in it, which isn't particularly well suited to stills capture. But it also fundamentally lacks really basic and important exposure tools that you'd expect to turn up in a cinema camera. So stuff like false color. It doesn't have any of Red's excellent traffic light exposure tools, geoscopes and stuff like that. And then the other thing that's kind of confusing about the ZR is its choice of red codec. So it uses a new red raw codec called Red NE, which is an incredibly high bitrate, chunky codec. Perhaps overkill for the type of user that's going to be buying this camera. And it's kind of confusing why they went for this instead of going for something that was a little bit more compressed, like we see in the Red Komodo that has something called ELQ or LQ, and those are what I tend to shoot on when I'm shooting with my Komodo. Sometimes I'll go to MQ, but I very rarely shoot in the highest quality mode on that. And I think the average user of a camera like the ZR isn't really going to be needing a really chunky raw codec. They're going to benefit much more from something that's a little bit more compressed and a little bit more friendly on your hard drive. So I think this is one of the things that Red needs to sort out in a firmware update, offer something like ELQ or at least LQ, a more compressed version of the codec, and then also perhaps even consider unlocking the ability to record to an external SSD. So the tools I've mostly been using to check in on exposure on this camera are primarily the histogram. I found that that's kind of like the best way to have a quick check-in on the exposure, and that really quickly visually tells me if something is clipped, and also just generally where everything's sitting in the image in terms of highlights and balance between highlights and shadows. So knowing that the red raw clips quite low down and knowing where the clipping point is, I can really quickly sort of change my exposure to make sure that the important stuff is not over that threshold. Next, I'm using zebras. I'm mostly using the inbuilt monitoring LUT on this, which isn't great. It doesn't look very accurate on the screen. So I've dialed in the zebras at around 245 in terms of highlight peaking. And again, that gives me a really quick indication of whether highlights are clipping or about to clip. But it does really need false color. And ideally, not that I'm expecting it in a camera at this price point, but I would love them to implement some of Red's exposure and focus peaking tools. Having the traffic lights would just be a game changer. I think the monitor is just about big enough to have that overlay on it. The focus peaking on this only works in log for some reason, which is weird. They need to fix that. And also, I would love some of the contrast-based focus tools that we have in the Komodo, because those are fantastic at quickly checking your focus, especially when using smaller monitors. Having that mapped to one of the quick buttons would allow people to really quickly check in on focus and tweak it if they need to. I did a little shout out on Threads a few weeks back when I was thinking about buying this camera, and I asked for recommendations for lenses, and overwhelmingly people recommended this. So it's the Nikkor Z 35mm f1.4, and overall it's a nice lens. I'm not a huge fan of modern stills lenses, and it's not too bad. I really wanted to test out the autofocus, which is one of the main reasons I bought a native lens with it. But the quality and character of this lens is pretty decent for the price point. It might not be great if you're a stills photographer and want like ultimate sharpness and stuff. Everything you've seen in this video so far has been shot on this combo. For a stills lens, it has just enough character to keep my images looking interesting. And generally, autofocus when using this lens has been surprisingly good. Like, I didn't really know what to expect going into a Nikon camera, but it's been fantastic. Like, I've really rarely encountered any issues with it. It seems to be pretty stable. It keeps things in focus when I'm moving around with the subject. It has good subject detection and tracking in it. I think the only complaint I have is just like the naming strategy of the autofocus systems in this camera. So there's continuous autofocus, but then there's also full-time autofocus. On other cameras, you'd expect to be wanting to use continuous autofocus, but in this camera, that's actually called full-time focus. So that was a bit confusing because when I had it first set to continuous autofocus, it just wasn't working. And I was like, what's going on here? And then I switched it to full time and it performed as I'd expect continuous autofocus to work in other cameras. So that's a bit of a quirk, a bit of a strange thing. And to be honest, there just seems to be quite a lot of this in this camera, little quirks and strange features where things are not quite where you would expect them to be in terms of the menus, or things aren't quite named in the way that you'd expect. And of course, it being a Nikon, everything goes the other way, which, you know, isn't Nikon's fault. My brain just has to learn that. But, you know, 15, 20 years of attaching a lens in a certain direction and turning a focus wheel in a certain direction, it does break my brain a little bit. So let's talk about IBIS. Obviously, coming from the Lumix system, I've been absolutely spoiled over the years with fantastic IBIS performance. So I didn't have high hopes for this camera, especially as a lot of the early footage I'd seen looked pretty ropey. The standard mode, I think, is designed for more static, stationary sort of handheld stuff where you're taking portraits. It's quite aggressive. It's going to keep a sort of quite a rock solid looking stabilized frame, but as soon as you move the camera, it overcorrects, it's too aggressive, and you get all these sort of artifacts and jolting and stuff. So the sports mode is where it's at if you're going to have any handheld motion or movement. So once I put it into there, I actually was quite impressed with the IBIS performance in this camera. It's not the Lumix God tier level, but it's kind of good enough. It still is a bit jolty, it overcorrects, but for my needs, like if I walked properly and was doing some push-ins and pull-outs, it performed pretty well, to be honest. Like, I was expecting worse and I was pleasantly surprised. One thing I was quite excited about was the fact that you could either shoot in 6K full frame RAW also just drop the resolution and shoot in 4K full frame RAW, because you can't do that on other Red cameras. Like on my Komodo, if you want to drop down to 4K, you have to crop in and window in on the sensor. But it turns out the camera's doing some pretty gnarly stuff to the image when it downsamples from 6 to 4K. I guess maybe it's line skipping or something, because there is just so much aliasing and moire and jagginess and shimmering on the image that it looks like I shot this footage on a camera from 10 years ago. It's not something you'll notice in camera as well, which means that I don't think you can trust shooting in 4K full frame on this camera, because it's only when you get the footage back that you're going to see the effects of this downsampling. I think maybe if you're shooting with super shallow focus and soft lenses, maybe you can get away with it if you're inside and filming people, but personally I just wouldn't trust it. However, when you crop into the sensor at 4K, so like you do on Red cameras when you window in, it seems to be fine. It doesn't seem to suffer from these issues. And even so far in my limited testing, I need to do more, the 4K 120 also doesn't seem to suffer from these issues, which is great. Honestly, the size and form factor of this thing is fantastic. It's just an incredible size, and the fact that they've managed to pair that with a huge screen is just the icing on the cake. Like, no complaints, 10 out of 10 there. But the size of the thing does lead to a few other drawbacks. Like, it has quite a minimalist design when it comes to physical buttons and dials and stuff like that, and it does expect to be used in conjunction with the touchscreen. And I think that kind of interaction can work if you've got well thought out menus like we've seen on Blackmagic cameras. Like, that camera is expected to be used largely through the operation of a touchscreen, and it works really well because they've got large icons, the menus are really thought out, and everything is where you want it to be. That's not the case on the Nikon. It's like kind of interacting with your standard hybrid mirrorless camera, but with a distinct lack of buttons to kind of interact with all the fiddly menus. Of course, you can interact with your fingers, but even me, with this big screen, with tiny, spidey, spindly fingers, struggles to accurately hit stuff. So if you've got larger, fatter fingers, then you're really going to struggle with this. And the only other way that you have of interacting with menus and stuff is with this little fiddly joystick that isn't particularly accurate. It doesn't have a lot of fine control over it, and you're definitely going to find yourself skipping past stuff or hitting the wrong thing, and it can be quite frustrating to use, especially in the heat of the moment. So you do get 3 quick custom buttons here that you can map. I just wish there were a few more somewhere on the body, maybe another button somewhere on the front, but I guess they've left that clear so cages can add grips to the camera. You know, the absence of the grip also does help keep the camera size down, and I'd rather be in a position where I have to add a grip and have the camera be a little bit smaller, because again, I can fit it into a tiny sort of day bag. I don't have to bring it in the backpack, and I can also fit it with a lens in a tiny pouch bag that I can sling over my shoulder and take out for the day. One of my biggest criticisms though of the design of this camera is the record button. It doesn't always trigger record unless you really jam it in, and that's a big problem. If this is meant to be a reliable video camera, the record button is the most important button on the whole camera. And there were loads of instances where I thought I'd recorded a clip and I just hadn't hit the button with enough force and it just hadn't recorded, and I hadn't noticed that until the end. So that for me is a bit of an issue. Battery life on the camera also seems to be pretty decent. Like, the native Nikon batteries seem to be pretty good, to be honest. Like, I only picked the camera up with one battery. It's a 2280 milliamp hour battery, so it's pretty decent capacity. Doing an afternoon shooting sample footage, that it's more than enough to get me through it. And then the other major gripe, or the gripe that most people have had, is just, you know, the location of the card slot in the battery door. I'm not too fussed about it. It's a little bit annoying, but it's one of those things I'm willing to put up with to get a, you know, 6K Red RAW capable camera at this price point and size. The lack of EVF has taken a little bit more time to get used to. When I was outside in bright sunlight, I just wanted to isolate my image. I did find myself, through muscle memory, beginning to bring the camera up and realizing that I didn't have the EVF there. And that was one of the main complaints with the Lumix S9 as well. Like, I do generally, maybe I'm just old school, I like having an EVF. I'm a bit shorter as well as a person, so holding a camera up like that at other people's head height is how I tend to hold a lot of cameras. So having the EVF for me is also about having a point of stability. If I can film people like this and look through the viewfinder, I get a really nice, level, stable shot. different people's eye level. However, with a screen, you know, you're holding the camera like this, which just isn't as stable. It's wobbly. It takes some getting used to, but again, it's a sacrifice I'm willing to make on this camera because of the other features that it offers. So I don't want videos to come across as too negative, because generally the core thing that matters around this camera is the image quality. And for me, it's there. It's fantastic. It looks stunning. And the fact that you're getting, you know, 6K Red RAW with lots of resolutions and also frame rate options in this price point of a camera with a huge screen is just fantastic. So should you buy the Nikon ZR? Well, I can't really tell you that. I think you should definitely go into it with your eyes open. I think there's definitely been a lot of hype around this camera. I don't blame people for the hype around this camera, right? Like, the camera is doing some interesting things, and it's doing interesting things in a time where cameras haven't really done very interesting things for a while. So there is a reason why people are excited about it, and I am also excited about this camera. I have enjoyed using it so far. There are some peculiarities and some little quirks and things that are quite frustrating, but there's only so much you can criticize this camera when you consider its price point and its form factor, and obviously what it already has inside the camera. I think also a lot of these issues can be addressed with firmware, and I hope that Nikon do see the writing on the wall and that they do follow through and that they do address and update the camera promptly with some of the features that the community has been requesting. I think you should never buy a camera on the hope or promise of future firmware updates. You should always be buying a camera on what you're getting on the day of purchase. So as long as you factor that into your buying decision and you're okay with some of the issues in this camera, then you should be okay. And I think I can easily see a similar situation happening with this camera that happened back when the original Komodo launched. And that's a ton of people rushing out to buy an affordable Red RAW cinema camera and then getting frustrated or upset because the camera makes them work a little bit too hard to get good footage out of it. You know, Red RAW, it expects a certain workflow. It's not going to hold your hand as much. You might need to do a bit of denoising in post. You need to expose it properly. And then you're also going to have to contend with, you know, large file sizes and stuff like that. But this camera is just going to make you work hard for the juice. And if you can squeeze it out properly, then it's very delicious. Anyway, if you are going to buy this camera, there'll just be an affiliate link down below. I'm Ed, thanks for watching, and I'll see you again in the new year with a deeper dive video on Nikon ZR. See ya!